So 2016 is over, and before 2017 gets properly underway, I wanted to take a minute to look back on the most noteworthy comic books from the previous year. Now, these aren't necessarily the best books, although one of them certainly is, but these are the ones I think that were missing from the list, which included things like Vision and Batman and Superman and Saga and The Walking Dead and all the classic, the books everyone's reading, everyone knows about. This isn't going to be those books. We're going to talk about specifically books I think were snubbed or which deserve more attention than they got. And I'm not necessarily going to talk about them all in great detail. They're not ranked, and I'm not recommending any one over any other, except for one, which we'll get to, which was my pick for the best comic of 2016. We'll get to that in a minute. But firstly, I want to talk about all the other books. DC Rebirth, one of the best parts of DC Rebirth, I think, was actually the Young Animal line that accompanied it, and particularly Doom Patrol, which is not a series that I had ever read before. However, this new Doom Patrol comic book is something quite different, and something that I think was missing from DC's line of comic books. Doom Patrol feels like an experimental teenage comic book in the sense that it appeals to youthful curiosity. It has a lot of non sequiturs, it's very difficult to follow, and I have no idea what's happening in it, but I'm really enjoying the ride. It's a book that doesn't feel deliberately edgy so much as the edginess is actually just inherent to the quality of the writing and the actual characters themselves. The swear words, for instance, do not feel like a product of puerile dialogue, but rather just a natural result of the authors not censoring themselves. It's a very interesting book, it's a very interesting line, and one of the best parts of Rebirth, I think. Otherwise, I have already mentioned American Alien, and this really was Max Landis' breakout year in the comic book industry, whom I think we'll be hearing much more of. American Alien was the best limited edition Superman series since All-Star Superman, if you're asking me. I mean, now we have a really good ongoing Superman book in Superman Rebirth, but American Alien was so refreshing, and I think it deserves mentioning, even though it was extremely popular. However, Max Landis is also working on Green Valley at the moment, which is in it up to issue 4 as I record this, 4 of 9, and Green Valley is like a very sincere, or it appeared to be a very sincere fantasy romp. And I'm really enjoying it so far. Max Landis is he's a master of dialogue and characterization. I think his screenwriting years really pay off. How screenwriting is often something that seems to be very compatible with comic book writing. And so I think Max Landis may be a new breakout talent, and Green Valley is very interesting so far. There are a lot of very interesting twists that keep getting revealed, and so far I have no idea where it's going, so that's always exciting. I really wanted to recommend Snot Girl from Brian Lee O'Malley, his follow-up to Seconds, and Brian Lee O'Malley is famous for writing Scott Pilgrim. Unfortunately, the cover and the first couple of pages I found so disgusting that I haven't gone back to it yet. But I have a feeling that is a very strong book, particularly if you like Brian Lee O'Malley's style. I can't recommend it because I haven't read it, but when I do read it, I think I'm probably going to enjoy it. Of course, we're also 2 of 3 issues into Jeff Lemire and Scott Snyder's After Death book, which I've been waiting for ages. And I still, despite having waited for it for ages, I still haven't actually gotten around to reading it. However, from what I have seen of it, the integration of prose writing with large double-page spreads and sort of Lemire's quite abstract artwork is really quite unique to comic books and not something that many other writers or artists are doing. And it's really exciting to have Jeff Lemire and Scott Snyder working on a book together. Plus, it's also being turned into a film, so I think this is definitely one to watch, and I'm definitely keen to read it when I eventually do. Paper Girls deserves a mention because Kevin Vaughan is awesome. And Black Panther, I think, deserves a mention because the author is Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is actually a writer for The Atlantic, who writes all sorts of wonderful political journalism. And I think it's really cool to have a writer like that working on Black Panther. Otherwise, I think the year was most noteworthy as the year in which Tom King burst onto the scene. One of his first books anyway was Grayson, after Dick Grayson was unmasked during Forever Evil, that event a year or so ago. Since then, he's worked on all sorts of things, including The Sheriff of Babylon, which I think is probably the book that he was destined to write as an ex-CIA guy. It's set in 2004 in Baghdad, about an investigator investigating a murder after the fall of Saddam Hussein, and it is just a stark contrast to everything else he's done, all the particularly fantastic stories he's written. This one is grounded in a way comic books rarely are, and it's a stunning piece of writing, and I don't think people know how to react to it, but it is undoubtedly one of the best books of the year. That book deserves a lot more to be said about it, and I will come back to it one day, but not now. Otherwise, the Green Lantern one-shot that he wrote as part of the Darkseid War story was fantastic. Will You Be My God, I think it's called. It's a very classic Tom King story in that it jumps between two different time frames. It feels very dreamlike. Everything gets reset at the end of the story. There's sort of like a few motifs that get revisited throughout. And yet it just fits together so perfectly. This is one of the things, I think, if you want to understand Tom King's style, look no further than this one-shot, because it really encapsulates everything about his writing style into one book, and exemplifies it perfectly. And he is a very good writer in that he follows a lot of preset patterns. I think Vision is another example of him falling back on certain behaviors quite a lot. And those behaviors are the reason that he's been so successful, because they're very well received. He actually reminds me a lot of Scott Snyder, who does a similar thing, though I think Tom King is a bit less predictable in some ways. And, as successful as he's been, not that the success is a reason to dislike someone, I think this is someone who really deserves the success that he's had. Everything he's worked on has been great. Particularly Babylon and this Green Lantern book I recommend. And the new Batman series is, of course, brilliant, but we're not going to talk about such obvious low-hanging fruit. The other book, certainly top 3 maybe of last year, was Black Hammer, which is written by Lemire also from After Death that I mentioned before. And this book, I think, is an example of a comic book following the footsteps of Watchmen. It fits perfectly into the Watchmen mold, which I think is pretty ironic because, Watchmen was, of course, essentially a rejection of the notion of superheroes and, Alan Moore's attempt to euthanize superheroes. And yet, Watchmen itself became a genre of comic books. That is, taking your archetypal or ordinary comic book characters and placing them into a real-world dilemma, which I think on its surface can be quite a cynical view of comic books. This suggestion that the only way to tell a meaningful or important or impactful story with them is to actually remove them from their world and transplant them into this real world of ours. But I think when it's done earnestly, and the cause is taken up, such as it is in Black Hammer, it produces immensely great works. I think, another example of this is actually Tom King's A Once Crowded Sky, which is the novel he wrote before he got into comic books. It's very clear from the beginning of Black Hammer that it is guilty of that Watchmen influence. It seems to be based upon a 9-panel grid, or at least initially. It seems to be based upon a 9-panel grid. However, it quickly shatters that mold. But it has an ensemble cast full of Golden Age heroes. And a lot of the characters, this is a fairly obvious thing, but it's well done here, is that a lot of the characters are either duplicates or clear analogues for other characters in mainstream Marvel and DC and other companies' comic books. Yeah, so you have Barb Alien, I think Jan Jans is his name, who is he's a Martian who can shapeshift, and he's Martian Manhunter for all intents and purposes. And you have the mainish character, Abraham Slam, who I think is a clear analog for Captain America. He doesn't really have any abilities other than he's just, he's a very good fighter. He's also a bit like Daredevil, but he's that more grounded sort of street level hero. Then you have Golden Gale, who is actually sort of an inversion of Shazam, because she's a regular person who becomes a child with superpowers when she says, like, the wizard's name. I forget what the wizard's name is. But there are also others that I don't think are quite as easy to catalogue. Colonel Weird, Black Hammer himself, and Madame Dragonfly. I have ideas about who they might be, although they haven't really addressed all the backstories of these characters yet. This comic book does some interesting things with the medium as well, which I think is also a prerequisite for a Watchmen-style comic book. For example, in the first issue, the main character, I say main character, though it's an ensemble, but Abraham Slam actually begins speaking as though he's talking to someone in speech bubbles, and it seems to be addressed to the audience, though he doesn't give any indication that he's actually aware that he's in a comic book. And then, very strangely, when he walks into another room with other characters, the speech bubbles become internal monologue boxes, and the monologue continues. And that's not something that they've revisited. It only appeared in the first issue, and it really puzzled me as to what they were doing there. There's also direct address in issue 6, but that is clearly direct address. I don't know. I think that there are a few areas of Black Hammer that they're not problems, they're not mistakes, I think. They're just unsettling. They don't really make sense to me yet, and there's clearly some things going on that have yet to be revealed, so that's always exciting. And it's always fun reading just a tribute or a pastiche of comic book history, particularly when it has, not necessarily new ideas, but still exciting ideas. Watchmen still remains exciting to me, and so seeing particularly a very talented writer like Lemire work on a story like this is great reading. So I recommend Black Hammer. It was definitely one of the best books of 2016. However, it was not better than my favorite comic book of 2016, which was Black Widow with Mark Waid and Chris Samnee. This is the closest thing you're going to read to a perfect comic book last year. Certainly the closest thing you'll find to a genre comic book anywhere, particularly because of the close attention that these creators and this book pays to the medium of comic books, and to just this tight construction and symbiosis of story and art. That is just the perfect vector for taking the story from their minds and just shoving it into someone else's. This is comic books at their absolute best, when the medium doesn't get in the way. The medium actually disappears when you're reading this book, and you're just there watching the story unfold. That's what it's like reading Black Widow. Absolutely perfect, and let me tell you why. The first issue of this series is actually basically silent. It's just one huge action sequence with Black Widow escaping from the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier. She jumps out of the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier, and a fight scene ensues. It's basically silent. For most of the issue, nothing happens. But yet, by the end of it, we've learned so much about what's going on. That is chronologically out of sequence from the rest of the story, and yet, by the end of the issue, we know that something has happened to cause Black Widow to betray S.H.I.E.L.D. We know that she has stolen some information from S.H.I.E.L.D. We know that S.H.I.E.L.D. is after her, and we know that she has some sort of mission going ahead, which is brilliant for an issue in which basically nothing is said. Basically, there are probably like 10 words in the entire issue. It's magic. It's magic to read it. Of course, Mark Waid and Samnee both worked on Daredevil before Black Widow, and Daredevil was equally brilliant. I think, actually, someone in the letters page said Daredevil was smooth jazz and Black Widow is ballet. And I think they're perfectly right, not just because there is one fight sequence which is actually depicted as a ballet dance in which Black Widow defeats her enemies while performing classical ballet, but ballet is certainly fitting for the sophistication of this comic book. I think the main reason I like Black Widow so much is its close attention to panel construction and page layouts. Now, most modern comic books don't have a default layout. I think a good way to explain what happened to modern comic books is if you look at The Dark Knight Returns, where it has those tightly woven, those intricate 16-panel pages, which is completely packed with story. And because of that, those books are so tightly woven, and it never seems chaotic or out of control, because it's always clear how to read the page. It's always clear where the action is. It's always clear what the chronology of the information is, and it's all laid out in a very systematic way which you can rely on to interpret the page. When Frank Miller wrote DK2, he completely threw that away. He completely threw away his default panel layout in favor of just complete chaos. And I think as a result, it really showed in that book. You know, if you've seen my DK2 video, you'll know I don't think much of that book. And one thing I think I mentioned somewhere in there, it just reads like chaos. It's just pure anarchy, which is maybe what he was going for, but it's still terrible. It's amazing like how much control of pacing and storytelling you lose when you move away from a preset panel construction, like 16 panels or 9 panels. Of course, most modern comic books just don't have that basis, and a lot of the time, it really bothers me reading books in which the writer hasn't paid close attention to how the page is laid out. Now, the really impressive thing about Black Widow is that despite having no default page layout like in The Dark Knight Returns or Watchmen, it still manages to have a really tightly controlled panel vocabulary that never leaves you confused as to what the chronology of the panels is, and it never leaves your eye confused as to where to look next. It manages to feel both perfectly premeditated and executed, while also being both varied and surprising, which I think is exactly what modern comic books have been trying to do by discarding the panel layouts. You know, I think this is basically where modern comic books have been heading for so long. That position of this comic book on the razor's edge, the cutting edge of this medium, allows it to do some interesting things with the story, because a lot of the story is about classic spycraft methods. It's not, Black Widow isn't a particularly technologically capable superhero. She's just very clever and uses a lot of classic spycraft stuff. So that juxtaposition is really interesting. There's very sparse use of dialogue in this book, which is fantastic which is fantastic if you can do it correctly, and these guys absolutely can do it correctly. It's very powerful visual storytelling, in that there are almost like these visual motifs and ideas that are set up throughout the book and then pay off at the end. For instance, in one issue, there's details of Black Widow's first kill mission and how she actually created the main villain of the arc of the story. Inadvertently created this villain when she was a child. And they managed to convey so much about this situation without much dialogue and without even showing the entire thing. They set the scene perfectly. They use a different color scheme, kind of a sepia color scheme, to alert you to the fact that this is happening in the past. And it stands in very stark contrast with the rest of the book, where blacks are very heavy and prominent. The scene plays out, very little dialogue. You don't even necessarily see everything that happens. The violence is implied and enough to wince at. But then you read the rest of the issue, and on the last page, all they have to do is put one panel there in the right color scheme to make the loudest of statements. This is a book that makes such excellent use of such a small amount of space. Such basic things as coloring and panel positioning are used to an incredible effect. And additionally, little dialogue really suits Black Widow. She shouldn't be a particularly talkative hero. They don't shy away from the darkness in her past, so it wouldn't make sense if she was particularly chatty. So I like that she doesn't speak very much, and I like that they're able to nonetheless convey the story so effectively with such little dialogue. There is also just no wasted space on these pages. There is negative space from time to time, but that always serves a purpose. It's always purposeful emptiness. They also do some really interesting things with panels sometimes. For instance, there's this one issue where at the bottom of a page you have two panels next to each other, both focusing on the same group of people. In one panel you can see someone speaking and you see a speech bubble. In the second panel you see the side of that same speech bubble indicating that time has not moved, but you are nonetheless looking at a different character. The only thing that has moved is actually the position, the focal point of the image. And that sort of fine control over your subject and over your storytelling is really impressive. It's not something you see every day. People willing to play with the normal presentation of such fundamentals as speech bubbles and the very progression of time itself. And yet they do it so simply and so effectively and effortlessly, and you immediately understand what you're looking at without actually having to think about it. And that's really difficult to achieve. And so they absolutely deserve top honors for that. This book also has a great story. I haven't really talked too much about the actual content of the book, but trust me, the story is fantastic. And it really respects the reader. There are a lot of clues as to what's happening in the story handed out in conversation indirectly. As I keep reiterating, the book is not full of exposition dying to tell you exactly the information you need to know. You have to, use a bit of your own deductive abilities and listen to what the conversations are about and try to figure out exactly the information you need to know. And more often than not, you won't guess the twists, where there are twists, which just makes them more exciting. But nonetheless, all the information you need to understand the story is there, and it's presented to you just indirectly. Again, perfect for a book about spies, not over-expositioning. It is the ultimate homage to the audience. There are so many nice touches with this book, and I could talk about it all day. The redaction they use on swear words is far better than like the alphanumeric keys you get in most comic books. Perhaps just because it's different to how it's typically done, seems much more impactful to me. Something so simple, which these creators thought to do differently. That may not sound like much, but it takes real insight to decide to change something so fundamental and simple. And you really just have to hand it to this comic book. It is, as I say, I think the closest thing 2016 had to a perfect comic book. I'm amazed that it didn't make it onto more best of 2016 list. In terms of what a comic book is, I think there are very few other examples of comic books that use the medium to the full extent that we see in Black Widow. It really isn't very often that a comic book actually respects the comic book medium this much, and it's truly exciting whenever it happens. So Black Widow absolutely is the best of 2016. Anyway, those were my opinions. I hope I said something interesting. I hope I kept your attention. What was your favorite comic book of 2016? What did you enjoy? What were you reading that wasn't so popular or wasn't on all the best of end of year lists? I'm looking forward to getting back to the video making very soon. Unfortunately, it's really hot where I live at the moment, which isn't conducive for good work, but I have many videos in the works. So, thanks for listening, watching. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now. See ya.